Right. Well, welcome, comrades. We come to the the really the nub of the matter. The point about we've reached in terms of the state of on a global scale, which is an important discussion. On the conditions in which clearly the crisis of capital is deepening everywhere in the world, and we see great outbursts and uprisings, and at the same time the use of the far right by the capitalists across much of North America, the hegemon itself in the US, Europe, and other parts. And we come down to the question in philosophical terms as it is put, the objective vital importance of the subjective factor, i.e., how much does the working class itself understand its own historic mission to abolish class society, and how far is it organised in order to do that? So the introduction of the of this essential subject is from Roger, and speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor. Thanks.
15 or 20.
Okay, right.
Okay. Right. Well, comrades, every week at WIN meetings, we hear first-hand, frontline eyewitness accounts of the dynamics of the class struggle in different countries, of battles, victories, defeats. And they all point to one question. What is the nature of the period we're passing through? And that's an even more difficult question than I'd realized when I foolishly volunteered to open this discussion. Now, all around the world, on every continent, there are tens of thousands on the streets defying police, tear gas, and bullets. The ruling class today are in no way complacent. They're acutely aware of the threat to their rule. They spend billions on intelligence bureaus and investigations, on police and spy networks, press conglomerates, academic foundations, research institutes, and university departments, and there are entire business empires monitoring it. And they report that there has never in history been such a universally disturbed outlook. Just check on the internet and you'll see many websites devoted to this question, like, for instance, the Carnegie Endowment Global Protest Tracker, which reports 258 major protests in 147 countries since 2017, and 83 major protests last year alone. Now, last week, we heard about the smashing of both the corrupt, inbred political gangster party dynasties in Sri Lanka, the landslide parliamentary election of a party which had previously led two bloody guerrilla insurrections following the mass uprising, or Aragalaya, which had sent the dictator fleeing the country for his life. The week before that, we heard of the mass uprising of the youth in Bangladesh, which had sent the Prime Minister likewise fleeing for her life. Previously, we saw thousands of Kenyan youth rallying for months, storming Parliament in protest against youth unemployment and higher taxes, forcing the government to retreat. And even the most apparently successful regimes are actually desperately unstable. I always quote this, but I'll say it again. Narendra Modi, in power for 10 years, who boasts that India has grown under his tenure of office from number 10 to number 5 in the world rankings of gross domestic product, and had deluded himself that he would coast to a two-thirds parliamentary majority in recent elections and impose a Hindu supremacist discriminatory constitution. What really happened is he ended up losing his majority, having been confronted by a months-long anti-capitalist farmers' full-scale siege of the capital city and repeated token general strikes of over 250 million workers. I know sometimes when I quote that figure, comrades look at me in disbelief, but look it up on the internet. It actually is the case more than once. Vast mobilizations then, huge determination for change. But in the absence of clear leadership, we also have rapid reverses leading to defeats. For instance, We had all the hopes aroused by the Arab Spring in 2011. Egypt and the other countries, we saw in all of them counter-revolution after brief moments of victory, counter-revolution, and even, as we see in Sudan, civil war. So it's a period of very sharp polarization. Along with continuing turmoil and upsurges and overturns, we also see an ominous pattern of what, for want of a better word, because we're cautious about using the word fascism, but what we call far-right regimes coming into power. Not universally, but that is the pattern in Argentina, in India, in most of the countries of Europe. Above all, of course, in the world's most powerful countries, militarily or economically. The apparently stable dictatorships of Putin in Russia and Xi in China, and now, of course, the shock return of Trump to power in the USA. So it can look as if the nightmares of the past have really come back to life. The whole period of turmoil has opened up. It's a bit like the period between the First and Second World Wars, when there was actually not one moment of respite. The occupation of the Ruhr, the Spanish Civil War, the invasion of Ethiopia, the annexation of Austria, and leading, of course, very soon after that to an even bloodier world war and the horrors of the Stalinist labor camps, the Holocaust, Auschwitz, and Hiroshima. So you could really say almost from 1914 to 1945, what we saw was a new 30 years war. So today, what about today? Are we entering a similar period? We see a genocidal war in the Middle East, a brutal proxy war in Ukraine, with missiles now being fired directly into Russia and the threat of a nuclear reprisal, economic stagnation and a new slump ahead, the risk of new and deadlier pandemics, environmental disaster, and impending, in fact, already raging climate catastrophe. So the issue has never been more stark, socialism or barbarism. The most crucial question for all of us is, what is the outlook? In that situation, we're all asking ourselves, are we too late? Yet many of these regimes too are unstable and their periods in power are actually fleeting. So when we look at regimes like the coming presidency of Trump, the regimes of Meloni in Italy, Modi in India, etc., ugly and nasty as they are, none of them have launched direct attacks on the working class. They've not been propelled to power after prolonged periods of revolution, counter-revolution, and civil war. They're all parliamentary regimes brought to office by elections. So every one of these monsters, whether you take Trump, Meloni, Orban, Erdogan, Modi, all the rest, even Netanyahu, even you could say at a stretch Putin, came to power within a nominally democratic parliamentary framework. And their positions are insecure and unstable. They lack the street-fighting mass social base that Hitler and Mussolini had. So there are limits to the power of these aspiring dictators. I think Netanyahu, of course, is an exception. Up to the outbreak of the Gaza war, his role too was foundering, but he's currently has gained himself a period of security, of course, at the cost of communal genocide. So the true balance of forces has not yet been put to a decisive test. Marx used to quote Hegel's haunting lines, "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk." A very haunting, as I say, poetic image, but what it means is that it's only in retrospect that a historical epoch can be neatly classified to conform to preconceived schemas. Only in its aftermath can you characterize a period or the direction in which it has taken. Let me take a few examples from history. Russia in 1917 brought us the Russian Revolution, the first victory of the proletariat anywhere in the world. But it came perilously close to giving us instead the Kornilov dictatorship, which would have meant the slaughter of maybe hundreds of thousands of workers. Then again, the period following the First World War brought us the downfall of the dynasties of Europe, the Romanovs, the Ottomans, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, but it also brought fascism in Italy, and it started the countdown to a new world war, paving the way towards the horrors that were to come. And yet, the decade of the 30s, which stands out in history as a period of black despair, of counter-revolution and fascism, also witnessed the Popular Front in France, the insurrection of the workers of Barcelona, the sit-in strikes in the USA, all of them manifestations of revolutionary potential. The Italian revolutionary Gramsci described that period as saying that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. I think that's a good description of the situation today. The old system is in a state of collapse and fragmentation, but yet somehow there's not yet a widely recognized viable alternative to put in its place. And that explains the great variety of morbid symptoms that has appeared again today. So this is a period of intense conflict, of sharp twists. I would say there are few illusions left in capitalism anywhere in the world. What has been lacking is confidence in the power to overthrow it. So it's an even more paradoxical situation than ever before. Let's look at some of the changes that have taken place. Up to 30 or 40 years ago, in the most developed countries, post-war consensual politics had settled the class polarizations. In the West, on the basis of a boom, a liberal so-called welfare state prevailed. In Eastern Europe and China, distorted post-capitalist Stalinist regimes were presiding over growing economies. The horrors of war and civil war were left to the colonial world, and sometimes that resulted in the emergence of populist regimes balancing between the two superpowers. Now, so what that meant is that outside the raging turbulence of the colonial world, after the World War, there was a strange historical interval of uncharacteristic relative stability. Now, that period of respite, obviously, is long, long gone. The world has been racked by intensifying convulsions. In the West, cuts in living standards, privatizations, attacks on workers' rights. In the East, the collapse of the Stalinist regimes, but in their place coming the rise of monstrous hybrid regimes. The neat tripartite distinction of three worlds is now blurred. Look at the other destabilizing factors today. 1. The terminal decline of the ailing superpower. US dominance has been already, or is being already, superseded by the entry of the BRICS. The 9 member states of BRICS now represent 45% of the world's population and 35% of gross GDP, while the G7 only account for 10% of the population and 30% of GDP. Other factors: there being no room left for liberal or social democratic reforms, the traditional workers' parties are all in meltdown. In France, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries, etc., etc. The one superficially apparent exception, the now politically emasculated British Labour Party, itself only won a hollow so-called landslide victory in the recent general election with just 20% of the electorate and over 1 million fewer votes than the temporarily divided right-wing parties. Another factor, the extraordinary polarization of wealth, the accumulation of riches at one pole, at the same time of misery, agony, toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. Today we see probably the grossest inequality in history. More than 3 billion people, half the world's population, live on less than $2.50 a day. 1.3 billion on less than half of that. Meanwhile, billionaires are seeing their combined fortunes grow by $2 or $3 billion a day, while the relative wealth of the world's poorest 3.8 billion people decline by $500 million a day. Every single day, for instance, the Watsons, who are owners of Walmarts, see their wealth grow by $100 million every day. Jeff Bezos, the boss of Amazon, gets $250 million richer every day. 3 Americans own as much as half the US population. By some estimates, half of the world's wealth is held by just 8 individuals. By the calculations, by 2030, 2/3 of the world's wealth will be concentrated in the hands of the 1%. Elon Musk will soon become the world's first dollar trillionaire. And by the way, the Indian tycoon Ambani is expected to be the second. Musk has bought the Trump government, and he's promised now $100 million to ensure that Farage wins the next British election, which is a very distinct possibility. So capitalism in previously some of the most dynamic countries has become increasingly parasitic, unproductive, speculative, indulging in get-rich-quick profiteering. Productive investment in manufacturing has moved, you could say, eastwards. It's a process in the traditional capitalist centres of gangsterization, and therefore we're seeing a political profile to match. Can we call this a modern manifestation of fascism? At one recent meeting, we discussed the defining characteristics of fascism, the mobilization of freewheeling, armed militias, independent of and auxiliary to state armies, as combat forces to terrorize and crush the working class and its trade unions and political parties. By a narrow definition, this might seem to exclude Franco's Spain, Suharto's Indonesia, or Pinochet's Chile, but I would say on the contrary, because these two, although the coup was initiated by the army, these two had huge private, unofficial, unaccountable private death squads, the Falange in Spain, Patria y Libertad in Chile. Together, they were responsible for many, many millions of victims. Now, I would have no problem in designating Le Pen or Meloni or Bolsonaro or Modi or even Trump fascists, or at least aspiring fascists. Maybe as fascist individuals, as fascist personalities, even perhaps harboring fascist programs. But it may be better to call them quasi-fascists, aspiring fascists, because so far they lack the human resources to establish authentic fascist regimes. They don't have the mass street armies. They lack endurance or stability, as was discovered to their cost, for instance, by Bolsonaro, by Kaczynski in Poland, by Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, and I believe it will be soon discovered by Modi in India. Now, that's not to be complacent. It's a highly dangerous situation. No empire cedes its dominance to another without a fight, or, well, I can think of one exception. The British accepted a role as junior partner to that of the USA in the special circumstances following the Second World War. But all the technology of warfare is now in the hands of unstable demagogues, Trump and Putin. Note, however, that there are only secondary tactical differences between the two factions of the US ruling class. Trump is not seeking a head-on confrontation with Russia, hence his promise to end the proxy Ukraine war, but the only difference is a tactical one. It's a difference about limited to how best to prepare the way towards a future world war with China, to either to appease and neutralize China's nuclear superpower ally rather than to weaken and exhaust it. The spectre of a new world war does lie ahead, but it's not on the immediate agenda. We have a limited time to overthrow the ruling class. So finally, are we descending into a new dark age? All the old spectres have returned to haunt us. As in the 30s, financial crashes, a lurch toward protectionism, mass poverty, abortive strikes and protests, the melting of old political allegiances, splits and spurts of new parties, realignments in the workers' movements, the election of far-right regimes in Europe and beyond, and albeit this time behind a paper-thin parliamentary facade, and in some cases, the beginnings of the resurgence of fascist street gangs. But every one of these regimes presides over a nominally democratic parliamentary system and are perched on an unstable and precarious base. Ugly and threatening as they are, the population of these countries is not yet crushed.
That's 20 minutes, right?
I just won my last point, Matthew. On the positive side, a new generation is now rising. The youth are taking up the challenge from the generation of the 60s and 70s. The very youngest generation are on the streets, fighting on simple agitational slogans: Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Extinction Rebellion, solidarity with Palestine. And in opinion polls, a majority of youth in the USA favour what they consider to be socialism, and it's a similar percentage in Britain and most European countries. And remember too that the working class is, for the first time ever, a majority of the world's population, based on every continent, also for the first time. For every one worker in the West, there are now 5 based in China, Russia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. There's also the fact that women now constitute a majority of the working class and are at the forefront of struggle, both as militant workers and at the same time in their role as traditional custodians of the family that are the cutting edge of resistance to austerity. There are now 3 billion wage workers worldwide, a majority of the world population, including 100 million industrial workers in China, which is more than double the number in all the G7 countries put together. China has crossed the line to become a predominantly urban society. The specific weight of the proletariat on a world scale is an overwhelmingly positive factor, and there has never been such international turmoil. So I would finish by saying the last word has yet to be written. The working class is not yet crushed. A period of renewed struggle is opening up, and we've been given, you could say, a last deadly warning, but the decisive battles are still to come. Thanks, comrades.
Okay, thank you, Roger, for the contribution. Anybody want to make a contribution or ask a question?
Yeah.
I think he was just applauding. No, surely not. Surely not.
Matthew, I'll speak briefly.
Yep, go ahead.
Yes, I'd imagine it's a small attendance. Imagine there'll be a chance to speak more than once. So I'll speak maybe by, not that we set it up in this way, but in a way to make some counter arguments to Roger's lead off, just for the sake of discussion, because I think we should discuss this through in detail. Now, the note for the meeting, it makes it various points, but it says an open forum discussion on the general nature of the outlook of the whole world is facing, which is a very important discussion. But it's a difficult discussion. It's a global discussion. It's always difficult to summarize what's happening on a global scale, but we have to try and do that. It's our duty to do that as Marxists. But I think we have to be careful. I think we have to stand back and try and look at everything in the balance, in the round, look backwards and look forwards, and just consider where we are in comparison to other periods. So Roger made some points about the 1930s, which are relevant, but let's look at the 1970s. So within all of our lifetimes, I think, and to consider whether, let's say, the world is in a worse shape or better shape than it was in the 1970s, or just in a different shape. Because we look back to the 1970s and 1980s, when I first became involved in political activity. If we look, first of all, at the state of the bourgeois democracy in the world in the 1970s, we had military dictatorships or elements of military dictatorship on the European continent, in Greece and France, or Greece and Spain and Portugal. We had military dictatorships in nearly every country in Latin America. We had military dictatorships or right-wing governments with military support in countries like South Korea and Philippines, which young people today would probably hardly believe unless they're students of history. that a country like South Korea, until relatively recently, was not a democratic regime. And we know that capitalism moves in the direction of military dictatorship or of fascism, but of alternative methods to rule when it feels that its rule is threatened. And the fact that capitalism can tolerate bourgeois democracy, even with distortions, in most of those countries now, I don't think we can discount that. I don't think we can say, it's just a different form of rule. It's a different form of rule because they feel more confident, not less confident. And they feel more confident because they recognize better than we do the historic defeat of the 1989-1990, the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. They recognize the epoch-defining nature of that defeat, which rocked the working class as a class in itself back on its heels, and we're still recovering from that period. And I mean, Roger made the point that all it is lacking is the confidence, the confidence of the working class to overthrow the system, by which I assume Roger probably meant the confidence, to struggle, the methods, how we can overthrow the system. But I think it is more profound than that. It's the lack of an alternative, a visible alternative, a credible alternative, a conceivable alternative. We can conceive of it, but most of the working class and the struggling masses cannot conceive of it. They cannot see it. So how do you struggle for what you cannot see? So that means, despite everything that's been outlined, which is true, uprising and struggle and rebellion in country after country, it is seldom with the goal in mind of actually overthrowing the system, of a new system. Whereas in the 1970s, it often was. In the colonial countries, in the colonial revolution, in all of those countries, people could see an alternative. Workers could see an alternative. Peasants could see an alternative. They could see that the Soviet Union had distortions, but they could see an alternative. And now they don't. And that's the biggest problem, I feel. And that's what gives capitalism more staying power than we allow for. And we have to allow for it, but if we don't allow for it, then we only demoralize our own forces. Because otherwise, why does this situation continue? And then the second point I would make is that capitalism has greater vitality and greater ingenuity and greater reserves in every sense than we allow for. And I think there's just very clear examples of that. Why else did capitalism make its way through and survive the financial crisis, the financial crash, that whole period, and the period thereafter? Now, we know how they did it. They did it on the backs of the working class, but they did it nevertheless. So, their system did not collapse. Society did not collapse because they had the wherewithal. They could still stand it back up on its feet again, and they managed to achieve that. COVID's a second example. Again, none of us foresaw that. None of us foresaw. I think we all could have foreseen a pandemic that was very foreseeable. The idea that somehow or another only a handful of people like Bill Gates could see it. Of course, we could all see it. It happened in 1918. It was going to happen again. But the way capitalism handled it, I think to an extent was unforeseen. I don't think I never thought that one through, and they did it. So capitalism has greater vitality, energy, and reserves than we allow for, and the working class are still suffering heavily from the defeats of how long is it ago now? 30 years ago, 35 years ago. We have to allow for all of that, and so a rounded out assessment where we are now has to take that into consideration. Now, having said that, everything that Roger said is true. None of us have time to study every aspect of the crisis individually, so we have to try and do it collectively. So the long-term tendency of the rate of profit to decline, the lack of investment in productive capacity, especially in certain countries like the United Kingdom, like Britain, is very, very important. But it is more complicated. It's complicated because there is a degree of reindustrialization in many of the advanced capitalist countries, America most prominently, but also in other countries where industry has been reshored. That's an important factor. The declining birth rate in Western European countries, the advanced capitalist economies, is an important factor, both in terms of the problems it causes, but also what it points to. Now, it causes problems for capitalism. It causes problems for the working class, and if you have an aging population, and who works in the hospitals, who works in the schools. The solution, of course, is to import labour from elsewhere, which is the single most important factor in the current context. It's not the reaction of the far right or the fact that working class people in the more downtrodden areas can see what's happening and see that they're being further disadvantaged. All of that's important, but for capitalism, the great relocation of labour is now on the agenda and will continue for the next 10, 20 or 30 years, and the millions, the billions potentially, just as, and I think that's a major factor as well. So it's a very complicated period, and the questions asked in the note for the meeting, the general nature of the outlook, have we entered a new dark period of setbacks and defeats? Is this an episodic backlash which will provoke new upsurges? How far can reaction go? Are we in a period of revolution or counter-revolution? I find it hard to answer any one of those questions. I think each one says discuss. I don't think it'd be right to say we're in a period of counter-revolution. I don't think it's right to say we're in a period of revolution either. Is this an episodic backlash which will provoke new upsurges? I think that is largely true, but certain developments like the return of Trump is more than an episode. It has a certain stunning effect, at least for a period of time. The general nature of the outlook is the crisis of capitalism, which has been a system in crisis not for a year or 10 years or 20 years, but for decades, and the long-term weakness of the subjective factor in the sense of the class for itself, but also the class vanguard. Where is the class vanguard? Reduced historically, probably a smaller layer than has been since Marx's time. If you think about a percentage of the population of the world working class, those who are organised and think about an alternative to the capitalist system, that's our problem, isn't it? And we have to try and overcome it collectively through every small discussion such as this. Some counterpoints.
Thanks, Kieran. Does anybody else want to say anything, or should I'll say a few things as well? I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think there's a few factors I think we need to bear in mind. I mean, first of all, is the impact of October 1917. It's as a historic move. I mean, what it does a number of things. It puts the capitalist class on notice. It says you can be disposed of. The more intellectually capable parts of the capitalist class understand that perfectly well. It also, of course, forces the capitalist class to concede on an epochal basis to the working class, both materially and politically. I mean, universal suffrage is not achieved in most countries until after 1917, precisely because the ruling class is so frightened. It concedes on that level. It concedes in terms of material living standards as well. It concedes the right of the working class to organise many cases as well. And therefore you can see, I mean, fundamentally what it does is, both in political terms and in terms of the operation of the law of value itself, it blows out a whole section of the actual foundations of capitalism, and fundamentally puts it on the basis, it's in decline, but also in the condition as Trotsky himself. I mean, this is the point of Trotsky when he writes the transitional program. He says this is a transitional epoch, and obviously things operate differently in transitional epoch because you're moving towards a different society. And therefore, obviously, what it does is, I mean, as Marx points out, I mean, the thing about, the great thing, one of the great things about capital and Grundrisse and so on is that Marx points out that the operation of capitalism is obscure. It's not clear. It's not obvious. I mean, it is a system clearly of basically of exploitation, of extortion, and of parasitism. But it's not. That isn't openly so for many people. You actually have to study the operation of the thing to understand that and the mechanisms it operates under, which is one of the reasons why it's lasted as long as it has. I think the other point I think is that the fundamental point to move forward, obviously doing this briefly, is to move forward to 2007-8 and the impact of that crisis. And actually, of course, what it does, if we go back to, the breakdown of the post-war order, the Cold War order, and the ending of Bretton Woods in the early 70s, and the move towards finance capital, capitalism actually moves itself towards a parasitic version, openly towards finance capital. Now, the importance of 0708 is it blows up. It actually, the operation of finance capital itself blows up in the hands of the ruling class, and it is left, basically scrambling around trying to keep itself in some kind of an order. And it's failed to do so. It has failed to fix all those problems. All those things are still there and getting worse. Actually, what it does is it uses the state in order, as clearly Marx points out again, so it uses the state in order to try and prop all this thing up and loads up on debt and so on and so forth, and basically says, well, you guys will pay for all this in the end, but in the conditions in which it's incapable of actually extracting all of that in the present. And so in fact what it does is it tries to postpone and deepen the whole question, and deepens the issue, but under conditions in which finance capital is clearly deeply unstable, deeply now dependent on the state for its very existence. The banks only exist because they're propped up by the state. They're effectively, the banking system is effectively nationalized, across the whole world. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. And so, in those terms, even greater political and economic instability. And the final factor, I think, which is obviously important, is the question of the subjective question of how much of the working class actually understands its own mission in terms of its political level and its political debate. And I agree with Kieran that obviously we've got a deep issue with this in terms of the issue in terms of how people understand what's going on, and the level of theoretical debate, which is generally quite terrible, actually, and the degree to which people are actually discussing and working out what's going on around them, and then holding a serious debate and producing, most importantly, producing organizations which are capable of actually taking on the historic tasks. And this is the major question we've got. How do we produce an organization which is capable of taking these bastards on, and actually saying to people, there is an alternative to all this crap, which will continue to collapse, as we can see. Throughout large chunks of the world. Obviously there are explosions, and the explosions will continue. And the systems of operation are steadily being blown out, both by the explosions and by actually the action of the capitalist class itself, and particularly, obviously, the degenerate parasites of the US capitalist class, who are destroying their entire world order, in fact, in order to try and keep themselves in operation. So, in those terms, it's a sort of it's a deeply contradictory and deeply crazy time. Thanks. And I'm sure everybody else will want to say something about all that now. Dominic.
Yeah, go on. You're on now.
Yeah, it's John Burns speaking.
John, okay.
I think we're in a really weird situation at the moment. Roger said that the youth were overwhelmingly in favour of socialism, or their idea of socialism. All the news reports that are coming in indicate that in large areas, particularly of Europe, a lot of the youth are looking to the right. The election, well, he's not elected yet, but the surprise first past the post situation in Romania of this non-entity seems to typify what's happening, particularly in Eastern Europe. And he seems to be an absolute nutcase. But because he was up against the establishment, the people in Romania, not in massive things, because when you go into the whole situation of how many candidates there were, he only got 23% of the vote, but that meant that he was first in the run for the for the runoff for the president of Romania. And what we're seeing in Britain at the moment is that on the fringes you have, if you like, the Greens, you have Extinction Rebellion, you have, as Roger said, the Black Lives Matter, Me Too, etc. but they're not coalescing together. And what seems to be a feature throughout, if you like, the Western world, at least, is the fact that you have populations that are at serious odds with particularly the social democratic leaderships. In Britain, I don't think there's anybody who in the Labour Party or who voted Labour has any great illusions in Keir Starmer and the cabinet that he's got round him at the moment. The position's one that he's now being berated by, if you like, the political commentators, that he came in promising change and there's virtually no change happened. I think because of weather conditions, I think in the last 3 or 4 months, something like 20,000 migrants have crossed the channel, you know, since Keir Starmer came to power. And he's supposed to have had all sorts of brilliant ideas in terms of solving the problem of that particular type of emigration, of having a fast track to, if you like, register people, to having, if you like, a fast track with law authorities in Europe to smash the gangs that are facilitating the channel crossings. The only thing that he's really done is take the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. He's not done anything as far as the commentators are concerned in terms of planning, which would free up the situation of a housing crisis that is absolutely massive. And quite frankly, the trade union leaders are sitting on their hands. They're doing nothing. They have, if you like, a political destiny in a way to lead the working class. And yet, whoever they are, whether it's the leaders of Unite, the leaders of, you know, the other unions, the RMT, etc., saying absolutely nothing. And I think in that sense, we're in a position where it's going to be extremely difficult. We're very small. Many of us are older and are not in a position to intervene as we would like, you know, as we liked in the past. But I think it's absolutely essential, you know, to put out the message that capitalism is leading us down a blind alley. Trump's got elected in America. His main program, which he will implement as soon as he gets the full power, is to increase oil production. If he could, he'd increase coal production, and he's flying right in the face of, if you like, the climate crisis that is spelt large. I mean, you're getting situations all over the world now where you're getting floods, you're getting landslides, you're getting all sorts of catastrophes going on. And then on the opposite side, you're getting droughts and etc. We have two of the most obscene wars going on at the moment in the Sudan and in, Israel, Palestine, where, if you like, Netanyahu is now, if you like, bombing tents and killing people. The daily report of deaths, as reported by Al Jazeera, is something between 50 and 100 people killed every day, Palestinians that is, killed every day in Gaza. There's little or no reporting on what's happening in the West Bank. And what does come through is that the settlers have been given their head and they're driving Palestinians off their land. They're attacking towns. They're burning cars and houses, etc. And there's absolute silence on that. The only, if you like, redeeming factor that you're getting, and again, it comes through Al Jazeera, is that many thinking Israelis, and I'm not saying that the people who support the Palestinians are looking at this in horror, not because it's killing the Palestinians, but that it's going to tarnish, if you like, Zionism. It's going to tarnish, if you like, mainline Judaism with the brush of being following a genocidal maniac. And that, in the medium to long term, will have no good, if you like, outcomes for Israel. And as I say, the situation's one where, because of the lack of any serious voices in the Labour movement, and that, I'm saying, I've highlighted this country coming out and saying, no, enough's enough, that we were sick and tired of bailing out the banks on the one hand, and when it comes to bailing out an economic crisis in this country now, it's the working class that pay for it. We see the situation throughout the Western world, where one barometer of capitalism is car production, that in Germany, in Britain, and in other countries, car production is going down and factories are being closed. And yet if you like, the leaders of the Labour movement are doing nothing except trying to ameliorate the situation for the workers that are affected, not looking at what is seriously needed, which is a planned economy. I mean, Matthew, I think, I forget your name, but you said that virtually the banks are nationalised, and that's what's needed, is the banks and the big companies need to be in public hands, because at the moment they are in public hands. If they hit a crisis, then they're bailed out to the nth degree. I'll leave it at that, comrades. I'm sorry, it's a bit confused and a bit higgledy-piggledy. I've got a good idea what I want to say, but I'm afraid at times I don't quite express myself as well as I would like. So,
Okay, thank you, comrade. Ian, you said you wanted to say.
Yeah, just a couple of things, and I don't agree with you, Dominic, on that last point. I think you expressed yourself very well. But yeah, just a couple of things on individual issues that will impact the whole world situation. On Trump, I think it's obviously a disaster that he won, but also one that I kind of saw coming. I was dreading either result of the election in the days coming up to it, but afterwards I felt in some ways more sanguine than people who'd been done a real disservice and had seen it coming out of the blue. All the stuff about Harris was on course for an easy win, and actually with possibly more upsides than if Harris had won, because if she'd won, it would have been that genocide was not a red line. That she could triangulate around the Arab community in Michigan, in an important swing state, on killing their families, just like she used to triangulate around people in that same state and many others, on closing down their factories and destroying their jobs. That would mean that the endorsement of Dick Cheney and that faction of the Republican Party that actually went with the Democrats really meant something and swung it to the Democrats rather than them being a very unpopular war party. With Trump coming in, there's some terrible worries of this mass deportations plan that he's got, which really seems like ethnic cleansing, to be honest. If he tries to kick out between 11 and 14 million people, they're saying, out of the United States, some of them born there, at the very least be like their Windrush scandal, but on a vast scale. And obviously his approach to the climate crisis and much else. But it was the result of an election where it wasn't a defeat for the left, it was an election where the left wasn't present. And that's not to cast shade at good candidates like Jill Stein and others, who Stein especially did very well in the Arab community. So were some districts, I think, where she came first, certainly neck and neck with the two main candidates. But compared to the last couple of cycles, Bernie Sanders' challenges inside the Democrats, and now much more widely held view that he should have split from the Democrats and stood himself as an independent. I think it would be to just like to say a straight line from the election results Jeremy Corbyn got to Tusk, for example. Some people and Tusk could say that's extremely pessimistic, an astronomical swing against the left, that it's that for the mass of the population, these left alternatives weren't even known. So the main distinction that the Bernie left had in this election was that it was the last people standing for Joe Biden after he became obviously incapable of running and the establishment were abandoning him. That even then they were stuck to the conventional wisdom of the agreed to support Tim rather than challenge him. It was really crying shame and something that the left will have to learn from. Ironically, with Trump on his approach to war and peace, he might well not live up to his promises even on Ukraine to stop the war, but it's almost like our old approach to a social democrat to try and keep him to his promises and peel off his support or sections of it even when he doesn't keep to his promises, and that there might be factions within his own government too, even if he doesn't or other factions don't want peace in Ukraine and might resign over it or be sacked over it or whatever. None of those dynamics would have happened. None of the scramble for a more realistic approach to possibly having peace in Ukraine would have happened if Harris got in with Cheney's support. So it's at least opened that thing up, though it's now in a very dangerous situation where Biden's ratcheting it up to 11 in this period before the handover. And I mean, he's promised a peaceful transition, all right. He's not going to have a storming of the Capitol, but World War III breaking out in the next couple of months would be even worse. And that's the fire that they're playing with this brinksmanship. Now that brings me to my last point of the really dangerous situation in the world that's opened up in just the last couple of days with Syria, where the Syrian civil war that's been frozen since at the very latest COVID has burst into flame again with this blitzkrieg from the Idlib, really fascistic, a lot of them foreign fighters forces now overrunning large parts of Syria. And of course, the Syrian civil war was one of the most divisive issues in the last 10 or 15 years on the left in the region, most importantly. Big factor in the Arab Spring turning to Arab Winter, and Netanyahu being able to continue his diplomatic stalemate for his very long period as Israel's prime minister and depress the Palestinians without that even being seen as the main Arab issue, while the Arabs were increasingly encouraged to divide and rule, fight each other over Sunni Shia. Obviously, the big question about was this an indigenous uprising against Assad versus a conspiracy by the likes of America and Israel. I think in this particular case, coming hours after the ceasefire in Lebanon, that it seems more than a coincidence that with the forces that were fighting for Assad depleted in that way, at the very least, it's opportunistic. But you know, in the last few days of the Biden administration, saw one quite cogent analysis suggesting this could be an attempt to get Trump to confront Russia, that he wants to dial down in Ukraine, but he's very pro-Israel. So to have a head-on clash between Russia and Israel is a way to keep Trump also committed on all fronts. So it's very worrying. We'll see if it has an effect in the Palestine movement on the ground in Palestine. but the reignition of that in the Middle East, if it does go much beyond this, the splits of the last few days, is something that I'm really worried about, and wonder what comrades think of that. If that's a new factor that we have to factor into the world situation, because I think a few years ago it was a major and very negative factor in the world situation, the situation in Syria.
Okay, thanks, comrade. Anyone else? Roger, do you want to make any? Oh, Roy, sorry. Go ahead, comrade. You're muted.
Uh,
To unmute. Okay. Comrades, yeah, as we can see, and daily we see it on our television screens, the world is in a very grim situation. We are teetering on the brink of so many wars, and we are in war in so many countries. Many commentators and analysts are fearing a nuclear or some nuclear explosions or nuclear disasters, or not really disasters, but the war escalating into nuclear wars. We are in that kind of a situation. But my concern is that in addition to all of that, is that the leadership of the industrial countries, the former colonizers, daily plotting, planning, moving, crisscrossing the planet and making arrangements for how better to control the world. From 1948 onwards, or 1947, the decolonization process hasn't brought the kind of liberty that the colonized had hoped for, from India to the countries in Asia, into South Africa, the African continent, and Asia, and so on. We have this sea of humanity struggling on a daily basis. Each day is just a challenge of just to live, to survive, to eke out a living. And that's not just all, you're in addition to that, being confronted with wars, with factional wars, which are also being propped up and promoted and funded and aided and armed by sinister forces from the developed world, namely America being one of them. But the other countries, France, Britain, and so on, are not. Germany are not without blame. And they, so that the colonial position transformed and morphed very quickly into a neo-colonial position. The economic exploitation of this humanity in so much of the world, the massive populations of the world struggle. And I think that is the kind of the depression, the situation that faces, probably is now being the chickens, as it were, is coming to roost in Europe, with the wars in the Middle East, continuous wars, the wars in Africa, all of these tend to bring in a whole, and the utter poverty in the South American countries bring on tidal wave after tidal wave, as it were, of humans seeking a better life and trying to, and hoping that they would get into Europe. In the same way we have in Africa, we have a whole range of the African population right from central down south, coming into South Africa, for instance, hoping to have a better life. And what happens is that they are condemned to live in squatter shacks, in tents, under plastic covers, with no jobs. When so that struggle just continues, having come through as people who are undocumented and so on. So we've got this, and this is being played out, and I think it just requires, I think, so much more
that has to be done, and that one even struggles now in terms of trying to fit it all, because we are talking at a global level. But in addition to the crises we see in Europe and in America and Palestine, which is a very stark situation. I mean, with none of, we've seen or we've heard of wars far off in other countries. Now in Sudan and so on, the bombing we've known in the Middle East, we've seen Libya, Iraq, and so on. But Palestine has brought it very close. It has defined for us what the Western countries, well, in this country, I'm talking about just the leadership, the leaders, whether they are from the right or left, what they are capable of how complicit or how guilty they are of genocide. And that is the situation. What we are seeing in Palestine is what's been happening elsewhere, whether it's been in India, whether in Bengal and so on. We've had those didn't come to our screens then. We didn't have them. We didn't have the media that we have now. And thanks to the agitational work and the propagandistic work done by Palestinian activists who now live in Europe and in America, we now get on a daily basis, we get a whole range of information. But that kind of what the slaughter that is happening in there is not, whilst it's terrible, and it's probably at a very at an extreme level, but that slaughter has also been in other countries, and it's been happening, and so we've got our own governments, or the governments in the former colonized world, also being complicit with the Western countries. I mean, there is always a clamor to get into G8, G7, whatever it is. If there's a conference internationally, the leaders of the South rush to get in. And so all of them are looking for better deals. Of course, the corruption, the thieving of the debt, of the debt, which is, or the loans that are given to these countries are stolen by and large by the leadership, leaving the population still in dire straits. So it's complex, but it seems to be built into a system. The IMF loans and so on. I think all of the consultants will run the different countries. We have consultants running South Africa. We have consultants, international consultants, who've been involved in corruption here as well, but they are in other countries and they do the same. And all of them are well aware of what's happening. They know the lies that are being fed to ordinary people. But that's the grim, depressing situation from my end of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, comrade. Dominic or John?
Sorry, it's Dominic. I had a problem finding me demute. A lot of I'm a bit overtaken by what the comrade was saying because it's a very global sort of spread. But the thing to my mind is that, is there 12 of us here today? We're talking about the need to change the world. And it can look very depressing and very downward, and really there's not a lot of hope. But I mean, socialists have been here before. I think, was it in 1912? Was it Lenin said there was it a coachful of socialists in Europe? And by 1917, things were changed slightly, you might say. So it's not for us to predict the future, I think, in the sense of, things aren't going to happen at what pace they're going to happen. My own view is that things are boiling, or the pan's on the stove, the lid's on, and it's a pressure cooker. And something's going to happen. Something has to give. because the thing I think that Matthew was bringing out, I think was important. It's a class struggle, it's an economic struggle. The capitalists and all the problems the comrade previously was saying are not created by the wind or the sun or some other thing. They're created by people, and those people are capitalists organising multinational companies to exploit the world and the working class of the world, and they couldn't give a damn about the consequences as far as either are concerned. I think Matthew's point about the, if you like, the nature of the exploitation of capitalism is something that's got to be spoken loudly, because it is true that it's very confusing to people who are not involved in politics and understanding it, of how exactly the capitalists make their profit. The capitalists themselves don't know how they make the profit as far as their public face is concerned. They sort of garble it in. The workers produce so much, we add on a bit of profit, and that's how it goes on. I mean, it's a load of garbage. If they only had a little bit of profit on, why don't they add a little bit more on them? They'd be much richer. You can't do it that way. The controls of the economic system don't allow that. The wealth that they generate is out of the labour of the working class. The wealth of the world is created by labour, and they take the biggest share because the workers have got no alternative but to work for them. All the other means of their subsistence has been destroyed by capitalism to ensure that they're, if you like, they are wage slaves, that they've got no other choice but to work, and to work at what they can get. And if the trade unions and the labour movement, if the workers organise and resist, they may give a few pennies more, while at the same time planning to overthrow it. So I think it's that sort of side of things, to my mind, that we've got to explain. Because if the workers don't understand that they're being exploited, or how they're being exploited, they haven't got a common enemy to look at. It can be diffused that it's a cause of this, a cause of that, the cause of the other. It's immigration, it's, all this sort of rubbish that the capitalists generate. So that one thing I think we've got to bring out is, the actual nature of the exploitation of working class and how that comes about. And when you look at all the troubles of the world, when you look at Sudan, the Congo, Israel, Palestine, and all the rest of it, it's all about the capitalists trying to maximize the amount of wealth they can create. As Roger referred to, the figures are absolutely disgusting when you consider the situation of the population of the world. It's almost as if the capitalists are some sort of aliens who've landed on this planet and are about to, exploit and destroy, like some Martians in War of the Worlds, to gobble us up and to eat us, and presumably at some stage make us slaves. That's the way I see the thing. It's a bit. It might be a bit science fiction, looking like science fiction, but when you consider it, it's science fact. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, comrade. Not dead silent, surely. Roger, do you want to make any comment?
If nobody else is going to speak. Well, yes, comrade, all right. Briefly, because obviously it's in the nature of a discussion like this that it was very diffuse, and there are many different points brought in, and I won't attempt to try to kind of answer them one by one. I think really the key question was raised by Kieran at the beginning, when Kieran said, "Look, it's not just that the issue is that people don't see an alternative to the capitalist system." I think that's not, obviously that is true, I agree, but I don't think that the distinction that he made with the situation in the 70s, or the situation come to that in the the time of the Russian Revolution, I don't think that distinction is quite so sharp or so decisive as he implied. After all, the Russian Revolution was fought as far as the masses were concerned, on the slogan of peace, bread, and land. It wasn't a question of changing the system. And of course, then when with the Soviets in existence, all power to the Soviets. But it's a question not of explaining. Of course, as far as the cadres were concerned, they were educated in socialist theory to a large extent. But what motivated the masses was simply that they were in an impossible, intolerable situation, and the existing regime had to be overthrown, and they had to exercise power through their own organizations. Now, what is lacking now, I think, is of course, is the organizations which can take the power. But I think people are impelled by the impossibility of the intolerability of the situation that they're in. I talked about for instance, the Aragalaya in Sri Lanka. The whole population, when you think of it, that the population had been through a horrible dictatorship, it had been through civil war, mass bloodshed. It had failed insurrections, which had only made even more intolerable the communal divisions in the country. A complete bloodbath that they'd gone through for 30, 40 years. And yet they came together because their situation they were in was simply intolerable. It simply had they had no food, they had no fuel, they had no means to actually survive. And therefore they came together without a slogan, of course, for socialism or for a new society, but they came together determined to overthrow the existing regime. Now, what that meant was it was very, very crude and simple and simplistic slogan, "Gotta go," Gotta being the nickname of the dictator of the time. But when he went, they began to draw further conclusions. And the next conclusion was it was not enough simply to get rid of one figurehead to be replaced by another one, that they then saw that it was necessary to overthrow the whole political parties that had been sucking their blood and exploiting them for the previous few decades. And they brought to power a regime which ostensibly, or a government or a party which ostensibly stood for change and for resistance to the IMF, to the world capitalist system, in other words. And of course, they'll be disappointed by that too. But many of them will learn from that experience too and start to develop theoretical answers and programs and understand that the whole system needs to change. That's one example. And I mean, the same thing again, we see that everywhere in the world. We saw that in throughout Latin America in the last few years. We've seen that in most of the countries of Africa, Nigeria, in Kenya, which I quoted before, how the youth, again and again, they were shot down, they were mown down by the police, but again and again, they stood and demonstrated outside the Parliament building and actually stormed the Parliament building at one time because their lives were just intolerable. And, when we talk about the youth favouring socialism, of course, I was generalising, and it's true that particularly in Eastern Europe, perhaps there's a different construction we could make on that, and that might explain the very surprising and bizarre result that we saw in Romania that the comrades referred to. But generally speaking, particularly in the developed capitalist countries, well, not only in them, but in most of the countries of the world, you see that that there's an understanding that the present system is simply not only doesn't work, but doesn't give them any kind of aspiration or any guarantee or any hope of any future. And the youth of Kenya and the population of Sri Lanka, and we could multiply that multiple times around the world, simply do not see any future, and therefore they're impelled to draw conclusions. Now, Dominic said, there's a dozen of us here today, spread around the world, one for every, I don't know, 50 countries in the world, perhaps. So it might look. I mean, the point is that we don't aspire to be the leadership. This is the difference, or one of the differences between us and many other aspiring socialist organizations. All we're saying is that we are people who are involved in the class struggle, individuals who are involved in different countries, who are involved in trying in the movement to try to protect the rights and the living standards and to develop the movement towards a new society, and that we discuss from each other with each other in order to clarify the way in which we're going to spread our ideas. And of course, all of us are involved in the labour movement in one way or another. And the question is that inevitably people will draw the conclusions. Of course, they'll draw them at different rates and at different levels. We are drawing the conclusions in our discussions today. But masses of people. When you think of the millions of people around the world who've been involved in occupations, who've occupied public squares, who've occupied housing estate communal areas, who've occupied student sit-ins and all the rest of it, you can be sure that they've been discussing and they've been reaching conclusions, and they are the complete ferment of ideas, and that will lead to an openness to the ideas. Now, the only other thing is saying that now, the situation perhaps in the Western countries up until now, people have been critical. People have been disillusioned with the society and so on, but life has been tolerable. That's no longer the case. The youth in Britain have got no hope of proper education, no hope of proper housing, no hope of a proper job, no hope of reaching levels of prosperity that that exceed that of their parents, and that's the first generation that has been true of for many decades past. And they will be more and more open to the ideas that we need to just a complete reorganization of society. They'll be very naive, perhaps, but we can be absolutely confident, particularly with all the objective changes that I mentioned before, the fact that the middle class has largely disappeared, the fact that workers who consider themselves middle class before and could be used as strike breakers, for instance, in Britain in the general strike, students were used to break the strike. White collar workers, teachers. Now, if you look at the recent strikes in Britain, there's been a proletarianization of society, not only a complete decimation of small businesses and what was classically the petty bourgeoisie, but also as far as workers who consider themselves to be part of an elite or part of a middle class. We see university lecturers, we see barristers, we see hospital doctors, and even consultants, all of them involved in industrial struggle. And in fact, the social reserves of the ruling class have become eroded and diminished. And generally speaking, on a world scale, on a global scale, the data that I mentioned at the end of my opening lead-off, for the fact that the working class is actually, for the first time in history, the proletariat is actually a majority of society in the world. The fact that the women were before, if you like, that they were subsidiary to the male working class, that now probably a majority of the working class in the world perhaps are women, and they're often at the very forefront of industrial struggle, as well as being, of course, those who are fighting for the social welfare struggles, of the against the cuts of the ruling class. So, I mean, overall, of course, I don't want to sound to sound complacent. Of course, there's no room for complacency. There's no room for not to feel horror not to feel alarm at the victory of the Trumps and all the rest of these horrible, grubby, nasty, I won't say fascists, maybe of proto-fascists or neo-fascists, whatever we want to call them. Of course, alarmed and horrified at the situation, and as I said earlier, the possibility that in the hands of unstable demagogues like Trump and like Putin and like, well, perhaps it's a little different with the Chinese regime, which still has some kind of stability, but nevertheless, of course, we can be alarmed and horrified, but at the same time, we can be confident that the worse the dangers get, and the worse the pressures, and the worse the privations visited on the working class, then the more ready they will be, and the more inevitable it will be that they will take up the struggle, and that our ideas will become those of a growing section of the working class. So I'd leave it at that, comrades. Thanks for the discussion. We're all, if you like, how do we put it, all improvising, all trying to grapple. It's very, very complicated situation. There are so many different factors, all of which are in many ways conflict with one another. But I think we've all learned from this discussion. I know I have. So thanks, comrade.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Dominic or John?
Me. Yeah, just thinking of a few things while Roger was speaking. I mean, I don't envisage our group ever coming to the stage. I hope it never will come to the stage where it envisages itself as the cavalry coming over the hill to save the day for the working class and take over and run everything. But I think that the important thing to my mind is, if you like, thinking of, I've forgotten the sort of theory of combined and uneven development. The working class leadership, we don't expect them to go through all the arguments and all going through all the history to come to the conclusions that we've come to. I think we've got to publicise the conclusions we've come to in order to help and shorten that process of learning. And I think that's why I think that it's not just thinking that the working class are going to develop. The working class, who was it who said that the Communist Party is the midwife of the revolution? Doesn't take over control of the child or runs it in that way, but helps the process of that developing. And I think that's maybe where I thought that Roger was a bit going off the mark a bit. I don't know. Maybe it's my understanding of it. I think the important thing is our voice has got to be heard and discussed with workers, and that's the stage that we've got to process to. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you, comrade. Do you want to say something about next week then, Roger?
Yes. Among the many, many elections that have been taking place, almost sort of 2 or 3 a week, was the Irish election, which took place just in the last few days. And
Not complete yet. We don't know who's in.
And I'm very happy that the Irish comrades are going to speak. I think Jimmy is going to speak next week and give us the usual clear, sharp Marxist analysis that he always does to this issue again. So looking forward to seeing you all next week, comrades.
Okay.
Jimmy, do you want to say anything?
Matthew, could I just come in here with a very brief update on the Irish situation? It's a very interesting election because for the last 5 years of the term of office, the government has been slagged and jeered and condemned for the way it has treated the people of this country. They have a very realistic possibility of going back into office, the same two parties, despite the fact that both of them, Fianna Fáil's vote is down something like about 0.6%. Sinn Féin's vote, who intended to be the opposition, is down 5 and a bit %. and Fine Gael is down. In vote terms, Fianna Fáil is increasing, Fine Gael is losing, and Sinn Féin are still much as they were.
Yeah.
There is
The lowest
a number
turnout.
of things that are worth noting. There's been a small revival, but a significant revival of the Labour Party with new TDs elected, and also with the Social Democrats, a soft left grouping whose vote is increasing. The hard left appear initially to have taken a hammering, and a number of TDs and potential TDs have lost out. Claire Daly's aspirations disappeared very quickly, and a number of other really good comrades are fighting to try and retain their seats. Yet it has to be noted that the actual vote has gone up for the left parties, for People Before Profit, and for the various socialist grouping. So there's contradictions there. Now, there's a number of things that also have to be noted. Just before after the election, there was a number of polls done, but one significant poll was asking people how they felt going into the election regarding the previous 5 years of office of the outgoing government. And a massive figure of 65% answered the question that they were either content or felt better with the outgoing government. Now, that's a contradictory set of figures to what happened before. But if it's true, it may in some way explain why there hasn't been a massive change. And there's one or two other points. I just have a page full of stuff written here. There's one that's
The thing I saw was that
I'll leave it
turnout
at
was
that,
the
comrades,
lowest.
and we'll fill up the gaps next week.
Yeah. The thing I saw was the turnout was the lowest in 100 years, below 60%.
Yeah. Now, the other factor that's there complicating it is there has been two real important factors, mechanical factors. One is the 14 extra seats introduced due to revision of the constituencies. And in that revision, there has been a meticulous, done to a fine tune of revision of constituencies where existing left TDs were. Well, TD is the term for political officers elected. But the left have been hammered simply on a mathematical exercise that you have to respect whoever put it together. They've done a brilliant piece of work on behalf of their class.
Okay, thank you, comrade. We look forward to that. So, yes. Okay. We'll see everybody next week.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Very good discussion. Bye.
Bye-bye, comrades.